Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before Jamie is packing up his cello, I would like to give him a big hand for the music he played for us. Jamie McLaren on cello. And we'll wait for the last people to drop in. Well, as director of the John Adams Institute, I have the honor to welcome you for an evening with Deirdre Bair, here in the West India House. The John Adams Institute is very proud to have such a renowned biographer in its lecture series. In a moment, Michael Zeeman will introduce our guest of tonight and will later on interview her here on this stage. Michael is currently correspondent for the Volkskrant in Rome, and we are very honored he accepted our request to moderate this evening. Before Michael will start introducing Deirdre Bair, a few practicalities. We will not have an intermission, and after Mrs. Bair's, so many people asked me and said, Blair is coming. I said, no, it's Mrs. Bair. So Mrs. Bair's talk, Michael will start the interview, and you will also be asked to intervene and ask questions, as Michael will indicate the moment. After my dear board member Gary Schwartz has closed the evening at around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Bair will sign her books at a table just outside this hall. If you decide to buy the book after, I think, a magnificent talk, but you hesitate which one to buy, the English or the Dutch version, I do take this opportunity to recommend you the Dutch version. De Bezerbij made a wonderful hardcover edition, and with their help, the John Adams Institute organized this evening. Thank you, dear partner. While you have your book signed at the bar later on, you maybe also be so kind to fill out the questionnaires which were put on your chairs and hand them out to our staff, volunteer staff. And to avoid misconceptions, we are a non-profit and independent organization. We do not have any share in the book sales or at the bar turnover. And we do still need supporters of our program to continue to bring the best of America to you. So if you're interested, you can also pick up an issue. It's brand new. It's made a new newsletter of the Institute on your way out. Before I ask Michael to release me, please switch off your mobile phones and refrain from smoking. Michael, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. In a very famous letter of the mid-30s, Virginia Woolf is reflecting on the genre of biography, which is, in both historical and in literary terms, a difficult genre. Everybody knows that as soon as you open a biography and you have read the acknowledgements and sometimes the introduction, you come to the chapter in which the hero of the book is born, and everybody knows why the figure is already, as a 0-year-old boy or girl, of the utmost importance, because we are reading his or her biography. So already in the first years, everything points into the future, which is the ground of the biography being written and read. So Virginia Woolf wrote, we should turn it around, because nobody has a tag or a label on his toe telling that he or she is going to be the important such or so in his or her century. We should turn it around and begin in the present. If we write a biography of somebody, we take a day out of the life of the figure about whom we want to read or write, and from that day we work our way backwards, so that the perspective is the correct one, because now the man or woman is important enough to gain our biographical attention. And the only things relevant in his or her youth were all those things that are still relevant in his or her life today. That is a very intriguing remark on the craft of biography. Reading Deirdre Bair's 4 biographies is as much an experience in 4 lives of 4 important people as in thinking about the genre, the craft of biography, as I named it. And that is because if you just for a second glance at her 4 subjects, being Samuel Beckett, Simone de Beauvoir, Anaïs and Carl Jung, you already see what she does. These are not the odd biographies of, in themselves, important people. These are biographies of people who lived their lives, worked their works, made their books, or whatever they did in their daytime, but also molded the time in which they lived and were, as it is for all of us, formed by that time. So the reciprocity of time and person reflected in life and works clearly is a thematic interest of the biographer Deirdre Bair is. You can see that easily when you watch Samuel Beckett's biography, made in the early 80s, late 70s, published in the early 80s, and about the foremost playwright of the 20th century, the man who changed the theater dramatically and consequently so. You can see that when you read her Simone de Beauvoir biography, which has a striking parallel to Carl Gustav Jung's biography. You see a woman who was a writer, but also the person who changed the fate of half of mankind by doing her work, and she did so by her experiences as a woman growing up in Paris in the early 20th century. The same goes for Jung, the man who invented another ism. If Simone de Beauvoir is one of the pillars of feminism, he is one of the founding fathers of the psychoanalytical practice, and thereby the child of his time, born in an age in which also psychoanalysis and psychology in his terms were formed, but also forming that time and having an influence upon us until today. He is, in the biography Deirdre Bair wrote, a subject to many conflicts. You can see that easily when you see the response in the press to the book, up until today actually. If you read today's International Herald Tribune, there was again a reaction to the book with a sentence concluding the review, which is odd for a review of a biography, saying if she, Mrs. Bair, really intended to make him a sympathetic fellow, well, she didn't succeed, if that was her program. Now, whose biography, whose scholarly, crafted biography could ever be intended to make the subject a sympathetic fellow? It is studying life and works, trying to give an interpretation, trying to paint a portrait, but sympathy is not your first aim. There is a lot of contention. There are many bones of contention in Jung studies. Many of them are discussed in Deirdre Bair's book, and I shall ask her quite a few questions about these themes later on. The style of that biography has something very curious to it, curious for me as a devoted reader of biographies. In the first place, it is the position not of a judge trying to come with an ordeal in the end, but indeed of a picture painter, being full of conscience in trustworthiness as far as the picture goes of the person we see, as it goes with Jung. And the second is, and that is a curious remark for me to make here, the length. I have often in public complained about these thick biographies, and I always claim they could be done in half of the space of their actual number of pages. This is a biography of 750 pages fine print, text, and over 150 pages of footnotes. So my first inclination was, how could I edit it and bring it back to, say, 375 pages? I could skip the odd comma, but that is it. There is no word too many in it. May I invite Deirdre Bair to give her lecture first, and then we'll have the interview.
Thank you very much for coming out on a cold and rainy evening to hear me. Thank you, Mikhail, for that beautiful introduction. I'm very personally pleased to be back in Amsterdam, which is a city I enjoy being in very much. I'm honored to be published by Biography, and it is indeed a very special honor to be in this marvelous facility and to be speaking to you here tonight at the John Adams Institute. When I began to prepare my lecture for tonight, I thought that I would talk about all four of my biographies and the impulse that led me to write each one of them. And as I sat at my computer and the pages piled up, I realized that if I continued along those lines, I would have to invite you to come here at least 2 to 3 times every week for an academic semester. So that being the case, I thought that I should limit my talk tonight to mostly the biography of Carl Gustav Jung and to some general remarks about biography. And certainly, if you like, in the later part of the program, I'd be happy to discuss my other work as well. But before I begin to talk about Jung specifically, I want to make a few remarks about the genre of biography and comment on its immense popularity in our time, when so many surveys seem to indicate that biography is the most popular and best-selling form of nonfiction writing, and some critics would have you believe that most biography generally outsells much fiction. People have been trying to assess just what the genre of biography should aim to be for at least several centuries. In the 18th century, biography was described as a mountain which beautiful youngsters climbed eagerly in search of information about how to live a just and moral and virtuous life. Well, that didn't last very long. By the 19th century, critics were upset that biography was being written to satisfy, and I quote, the public's voracious appetite for the lives and sufferings of the eccentric, the humble, and the abused, of dwarfs, contortionists, pirates, and cheats. Throughout most of the 20th century, biography was thought to have, again I quote, descended from its dignity. It has become a malignant curiosity. Indeed, the Victorian novelist George Eliot called biography the disease of English literature. Closer to the millennium, the novelist Joyce Carol Oates defined it as pathography. Oates, it seems, is only the latest in a succession of writers who have been attempting to define biography for years. In 1911, Edmund Goss called it a mere subgenre of history. It is a study sharply defined by 2 definite events, birth and death. Desmond McCarthy in the 1930s said, the biographer must be the artist under oath. Well, W.H. Auden didn't agree. Biography, he said, is always superfluous and usually in bad taste. In terms that Jung would have liked, Vladimir Nabokov called it psychoplagiarism. And Jung's old bugaboo, James Joyce, had ill-concealed contempt for the biographiend. But when I began to write about Carl Jung, it seemed to me that Oscar Wilde had said it best. Every writer has his disciples, and usually Judas writes the biography. So I'm going to turn now specifically to Jung and talk a little bit about how I came to write the book and why it became the kind of book that it is, the doorstop, or as my American publisher called it, the whopper. The process of writing that book began in 1994, almost a full year before I could bring myself to make the commitment to write it. It began with a series of those random coincidences that Jung called synchronicity. I was just finishing my third biography of Anaïs Nin, and I really was not sure that I could withstand the rigors of writing another one. I was looking for another form of nonfiction writing. And I told all this to a Freudian psychologist who had come to talk to me about Samuel Beckett, the subject of my first biography. This fellow wanted to know how I could possibly have written that Carl Jung had an influence on Samuel Beckett when Samuel Beckett went to hear Jung's Tavistock lectures in the 1930s in London. At any rate, there was a very great influence of Jung on Beckett, but at the time I had no idea that I would ever be writing about Jung, so I didn't make too much of it in the book. Well, this psychologist suggested that I really shouldn't abandon biography altogether, but that I should simply move outside the literary world, and he said he had a perfect subject for me. He had just attended a conference where historians of psychoanalysis who represented all the different analytic persuasions had been asked to take an informal vote. What was the one single book that the history of psychoanalysis needed most? And the overwhelming answer was an objective biography of Carl Jung. "Why don't you write it?" he said to me, and I said something probably like, "Oh, sure, tomorrow," and promptly forgot about it. But Jungian synchronicity was indeed at work here, and several weeks later, a reporter friend who had just come back from Switzerland, where she had covered an event in Geneva, a political event, said the most curious thing about her visit was that the one name that was mentioned constantly was neither French nor political. It was that of Carl Jung. "No one seems to know anything about him, anything truthful about him," she said, "and wouldn't he be an interesting person for me to write about?" And so it went for the better part of a year. Suddenly, quite a lot of people who didn't know each other, and in many cases didn't really know me either, were asking if I had ever thought of writing about Carl Jung. 8 months after these synchronistic encounters, my agent was getting quite nervous about what I would turn to next. And she took me to dinner to try to persuade me to make up my mind about the several ideas that I really was considering semi-seriously. And in the course of conversation, I said, "Well, let me tell you about one of the more novel suggestions that keeps coming my way, one that certainly I'm not going to take very seriously. That's a biography of Carl Jung." "Well," she said, "I should give it serious consideration, because Jung was exactly the sort of person whose life and work excited me, a person whose influence on our contemporary cultural climate was great, but whose contribution was still largely unmeasured and mostly incorrectly evaluated." "Well," said I, "when you put it in those terms, I still have reservations, but I think I'd better start thinking seriously about it." So I began to read all of Jung's writings that were already on my bookshelves, and to my surprise, when I looked at them in their totality, they were many. I had first read them as a doctoral student in, of all things, medieval comparative literature, even though I did end up teaching postmodern literature most of my career. And at the time, I had studied Jung's writings about alchemy, mythology, and comparative religions, and I had also read, translated from medieval Latin in many cases, many of the texts that he had read and that he had written about. I came of age in the generation of American feminists who had reservations about Freud because, rightly or wrongly, we thought that he had neglected our half of the human race. So when I became a professor of literature, and I had to teach graduate students how to assess it from different critical perspectives, the psychoanalytic, of course, being prominent among them, I did teach Freud, but I gravitated to Jung because he dealt more with the topics that interested me and the students whose dissertations I was advising. So the time now in the life of the Jung book is early 1995. And as I reread his writings, I realized that the only background I lacked to write about him was clinical training. I had no clinical education, psychological education at all. And this was certainly a major concern, and it gave me much pause. But I decided to proceed with the biography despite it, because I hoped to enlist members of the analytic profession to act as advisors and consultants. And I was indeed very fortunate that so many cooperated with me, because without their contributions, I think my book would be very poor indeed. So in mid-1995, excuse me, in mid-1995, when I made the commitment to write about Jung, it was time to begin to think seriously about the one question that had intrigued me from the first. Why did so many clinical professionals believe that an objective biography of Jung was so urgently needed? When I pressed for their reasons, they pointed to the negative biographies already in existence, which they usually blamed for their negativity on the possible influence or obstruction of the Erbengemeinschaft Sege Jung, which of course was the official committee of his heirs. When I read these already published biographies of Jung, I had an inkling of why this sorry reputation might have settled on his heirs. With the exception of Gerhard Wehr's respectful chronology of the public facts and events of Jung's life and work, and Barbara Hanna's fond personal memoir, all the other biographies ranged from the supercilious and the smug, to the condescending, to the derogatory, to the scathingly negative. And again came the question that puzzled me. What had inspired such vitriol, such animosity in all these other biographers to make them write so negatively about Jung? Surely there had to be other reasons than to blame the committee of his heirs. I thought about this before I went to meet Jung's children and grandchildren for the first time. And I did an informal survey of prominent persons who had been the subject of multiple biographies. And I decided that they all followed a pattern. So here follows the Deirdre Bair theory of biography. The first ones are usually hagiography, and they portray the subject as Saint so-and-so, the good and the great. The next biography begins the process of revisionism and generally gives the warts and all, as Oliver Cromwell called it. And after that, indeed, Oscar Wilde's dictum takes over. No matter how many disciples they are, Judas usually writes the biography. Well, Jung had landed in Judas territory from the beginning. So how, I wondered, could all the other biographers who came before me have spent so many years in the company of a subject they so clearly despised? Now, I hope this is a question that someone might have the opportunity to ask all these other biographers to answer, but I'm not going to speculate on it. And I'm now going on to speak about my own work and how I became convinced that someone really did need to go in search of whatever it was in the life and work of Jung that we call, in our postmodern age, the objective truth. I suppose if I had to pick a motto for how I write biography, it probably would be Desmond McCarthy's instruction that the biographer must be the artist under oath. In other words, and in my own irreverent paraphrase, you must tell only the truth, but you have to tell it as a page turner, as the best possible story. And that's what I tried to do. I began with the Erbengemeinschaft Jung, the formal committee of his heirs who control access to his published and his unpublished writings and to his voluminous correspondence. Note how specifically I say published and unpublished writings and voluminous correspondence. That's all that they controlled. I met them for the first time in June 1995 in Zurich. Before the meeting, I sent them my 3 previous biographies in their German translations of Beckett, Beauvoir, and Nin. And at the first meeting, the family members were cordial, but they were quite distant. They made it clear that they had been badly burned by the negativity of so many previous writers, And they also told me what I already knew, that Jung had most recently been denounced by an American scholar named Richard Knoll. Jung had been denounced on the front page of the New York Times as a liar and a thief. And I'll return to that a bit later. But at my first meeting with the Jungers, I was fortunate in my timing because several leading German literary critics had just published a series of articles about the lack of a biographical tradition in German-speaking cultures and how much really one was needed. As they pondered about how they might establish this tradition, the critics suggested that there were a few examples they might emulate from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Now, I didn't know about those articles at the time. I hadn't read them before the Jungers told me about them. And I must say that it certainly helped my case that Bair came before Caro and Adele among the Americans who were listed, so they had paid attention to my name. I told them then, and I still remain very proud, that all of my writing has been praised for the many facts and the objectivity. But at my initial meeting with the Jungers, this was not the positive fact in my favor that I hoped it would be, because they realized from the start that they would not have any control over what I wrote. I told them that I could not risk accepting any sort of participation from them because it would give rise to the accusation that they had influenced my book's content. I told them that I hoped that they would eventually give me their full cooperation so that I could write Jung's biography as I had written all my others, with full and open access to whatever documents they controlled that I wished to read. When they hesitated over a period of months, if not years, I told them bluntly that their reputation for interference, whether true or not, and I'll tell you that it is mostly untrue, would discredit every sentence that I wrote if they read my book before it was published. Eventually, they acquiesced, and to their credit and to my great relief, they allowed me to quote from every unpublished letter, manuscript, or photo that they controlled and that I wanted to use. However, because there are probably persons in this audience tonight who wish to do research in the history of psychoanalysis, and particularly in the Jungs Archives, I should speak to you briefly about what you may encounter. Even though all of Jung's archives have been deposited in the ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, the heirs retain control of them, so that access is rigidly monitored. Scholars cannot read anything until or unless a member of the family goes there and reads it first. And scholars generally need to know what it is they want to read before they even get to the ETH, because sometimes they don't even let you read the card catalog, and what is listed is often neither accurate nor useful. But again, I want to stress that this applies only to the documents under the control of the Jung family. So there are many, many other archives that they do not control, and this I'm going to talk about again shortly. People frequently ask, why does a biography take so long to write? And the case of Jung and the family-controlled archives provides a good example. I needed to give the ETH a minimum of 6 weeks' notice for them to prepare the documents I wanted to read on any particular research trip. And even then, the Jungers usually did not get around to vetting everything before my arrival. So I had to allow massive amounts of time, which meant that I went to live in Zurich every year for a minimum of 1 to 4 months, and in the beginning, I went twice each year. Being there for such lengthy periods of time meant that I had a lot of time to twiddle my thumbs, but it also had tremendous additional benefits for my book that it might not otherwise have had. First of all, it became a way of integrating myself into the life of the community. Friends in the clinical professions in other cities introduced me to their counterparts in Zurich, both within and far removed from the Jungian analytical practice and theory. I met all of these people eagerly for interviews and conversations, and I accepted their invitations for social occasions. And all of this provided me with a truly important foundation for me to understand what I called Jung's Swissness. Some examples, just very fleeting examples. I learned so much about Jung's political naivete from the distinguished former mayor of Zurich, Sigmund Widmer, who had been prominent among those persons who persuaded Jung to stand for political office, local political office, within the conservative Duttweiler party. Both Jung and the Duttweiler party lost. Some of the leading Freudians who represented the two divided and warring factions in Switzerland explained to me the history of how their split came about, of all the quarrels, internecine quarrels over their doctrine, and its possible spillover into the various Jungian groups, which in recent years have begun to quarrel in Zurich. Marie-Louise von Franz and C.A. Meyer, who were two of the last remaining colleagues of Jung in his lifetime, gave me important interviews and answered all my questions, no matter how many times I repeated them or how simplistic they might have seemed. And other Swiss scholars introduced me to the fables and the folklore of the Lake Constance area, many of which had been so important in Jung's childhood. Jung's children and grandchildren took me to the actual places where Jung lived and to other settings where important events happened. They showed me the famous break front where the bread knife cracked, which he describes so eloquently in his own autobiography. And they let me roam freely throughout Jung's library and his study. Through friends in the United States, I was able to add another dimension to this book, one that gave me information that I would not otherwise have found. I was introduced to an American woman who had married a wealthy Swiss man way back in the 1950s, and she had lived there ever since. And she, in turn, introduced me to her friends, both American and Swiss, who were deeply integrated into a variety of Swiss social classes and cultures. It was through them that I learned much about Jung's reputation in the early years of the 20th century, as they told me what their parents said or wrote about their analytic sessions with Jung. They made their parents and grandparents letters and diaries and analytic journals available for my book, and they showed me Jung's portion of any correspondence, where it was still extant. Other friends in the American and British worlds of medicine, law, journalism, and academe introduced me to their Swiss counterparts. They did hard, slogging, archival research for me. And in the process, I think they had a lot of fun. For example, I wanted to use a photograph that appeared in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, but the photographer wanted just an exorbitant amount of money for it. And one of his colleagues was a friend of mine, a reporter on that newspaper. And he said, "You don't need to pay for that picture. I'll get you a picture." So he rented a boat, got his girlfriend and a bottle of wine, went out on the lake for an afternoon, and took wonderful pictures for me. I wasn't able to use them for a very good reason. Carl Jung's grandson, also named Carl, made a photo that he had taken from the same place available to me. But seriously, I've been talking all day long. No, that's okay, thanks. All these people helped me to ground myself and ultimately to ground Jung in the Swiss culture and society that produced him and made him the man that he became. And because of the happy accident of my having to sit and twiddle my thumbs in Zurich, I did more than just rush into and out of libraries and archives. I learned a lot about contemporary daily life, and especially daily life as it was lived in Jung's time and as he personally experienced it. And some of the people I encountered produced documents that gave me answers to some of the nastiest accusations and allegations that plagued Jung's life, particularly concerning the Honegger papers or the alleged Nazi collaboration, both of which I'm going to talk about more specifically in a moment. But before I do that, I want to say one last thing about the concept of privacy, paramount with every Swiss person I encountered. When I found myself, as I said, twiddling my thumbs while waiting for a member of the Jung family to go to the ETH and read a dossier so that I could read it, frequently the phone in my apartment rang, usually early in the morning or late at night. And the caller would say, "Well, I've observed you," or "I've heard from someone else the kind of questions you ask in your interviews," or "I've heard about the sort of book that you were writing." And then the callers would say, "I'm going to trust you with the letters and the diaries and the analytic journals, the ones that I refer to in the book's notes as private sources, private archives." These people said, "You can use these documents," but in many cases they said, "You can never identify who wrote them." So I replied that I had written 3 previous biographies in which I named every source, and I cited every single document with great specificity. And these people became very agitated, and they said that I could never ever name my source, not even far in the future, if I were to make a list of all these persons and deposit them in a very secure library facility, say 50, 100 years into the future. To do so, they said, in a country such as ours, would still cause them and their descendants shame, embarrassment, and distress of epic proportion. I had to agree to use these materials without specific citation and never to reveal the source. And I agreed to honor their requests because in many cases this information was really crucial. Switzerland, of all the countries where I have ever conducted research throughout Europe, is the only one where such a stricture has been imposed on me. The other issue of privacy pertains specifically to clinical professionals, and this is the question of doctor-patient confidentiality. The Jung heirs insist that Jung kept no analytic records, but many of his patients kept detailed accounts of their sessions with him. And even though the accounts were certainly one-sided because they were only seen from the patient's perspective, I thought it would be useful to have a chapter in which I could gather as many of these different accounts of how the patient perceived analysis with Jung. And so I did that. This is my chapter 26. Many of these analysans said, you can use the oral or the written accounts, but only some would say, you can name me, you can say who I am and why I kept this account. Others said, you can only use my account if you create a fiction, if you create a case study, which of course that's the clinical term for what psychoanalysts do to present information about their patients to their colleagues, and which I, of course, as a literary historian, call the ultimate fiction. Well, in several of these instances, these patients who kept these analytic diaries said that to ensure that there would be no risk of revealing their identities, I was instructed that I couldn't even use a pronoun that might identify the informant as male or female. And I want to give you a little exercise. Just try writing a paragraph about someone without using a pronoun. It's probably some of the most difficult writing you'll ever do. Well, I had Jung's version of what happened in analytic sessions in only one instance, and this was with the diary of a woman named Mary Breener. She and Jung had had a significant correspondence about her desire to publish this analytic diary that she had kept over a period of almost 20 years. Jung made an anguished response to her request. He said, how could she possibly convey the overtones and the undertones, the facial expressions, the bodily gestures of everything that happens between the analyst and the analysand within the analytic session? So at any rate, this entire chapter, I used a quotation from Jung in which he talked about his unconventional analytic hours, and that's the title that I gave to it. I think what's important about the way Jung conducted analysis was that he seems, at least in the accounts that I've read or been told about, never to have done the same thing twice. He treated each patient with the individual concern and care that he believed the patient needed. He had no organized theory under which to conduct his treatment. I'm going to move on now to the four major areas in which there has been so much misunderstanding about the facts and events of Jung's life. And I do regret that I'm only able to give you some high points and brief summations, but perhaps we can talk about it later. I'm going to start with his relationship with Tony Woolf, who formed one point of the lifelong triangle with Jung and his wife, Emma. Tony Woolf was his mistress and professional colleague for a period of more than 40 years. I was very fortunate to have the full cooperation of the members of Tony Woolf's family and to be able to read the surviving documents after her death. As I read those letters in those diaries, they led me to the names of Tony Woolf's friends and professional colleagues throughout the world, so that I was able to speak to the ones still alive and to interpret the delicate balance of man, wife, and mistress, or as Jung called her with great respect and great consideration, his other wife. Tony Woolf's mother brought her to Jung as his patient when he was in his early 30s and she was 20 and deeply depressed over her father's death. At a time when there were no professional rules or boundaries between doctor and patient, and after so much distress on Jung's part that he thought he would literally have to commit suicide, he and Tony Woolf became lovers. Jung told his wife Emma that he could not dishonor Tony, whose family was of the highest social class in Zurich and whose origins dated back to the 13th century and the rules of confederation that created the Swiss democracy. Jung said he had to treat Tony Woolf as a second wife, which Emma understood entirely because her background was similar. She was an heiress to great wealth. She was the second richest woman in Switzerland, and she was deeply imbued with the strictures about privacy that governed her own upper class background. So the drama, the pathos, and the pain that each of these three persons felt, all of this is in my book and mostly presented in the words of this threesome, this sad triangle, or through the observations of their closest contemporaries. Nevertheless, I must tell you that of all the questions I have been asked over the years by intelligent and educated people, the most frequent one is about Jung's alleged mistreatment of women or his misappropriation of their intellectual property. I saw, as I said, many letters written by Jung to and from the women who were known as the Zürichberg Pelzmantel, the rich ladies who lived in the suburb of Zurichberg and wore fur coats, and who were among the first to seek the attentions of the mind doctor, as Jung was known to their social class. I've paid very careful attention to the recent scholarship concerning the American woman Christiana Morgan, who made paintings and told Jung her dreams, which he misappropriated, some say, as his so-called visions seminars. He used her as she was actually an easily identifiable person. So that's where the misappropriation comes in. And I have been following with great interest the recent scholarship about Jung and the woman named Sabine Spielrein, who has now been given her rightful credit, her due, as one of the early, certainly the first woman theorist in the field of the history of psychoanalysis and the development of the theory. However, with all of these relationships, to use a political metaphor, I did not find the smoking gun. There were certainly lots of flirtatious, double entendre kinds of letters, but there was no actual written proof that any actual affair relationship existed. However, I think in many instances, I left it to my reader to apply common sense, and I think that my readers are pretty well on target when they assess some of these relationships. Now I want to go to the Honegger papers, the ones that Richard Knoll claimed Jung stole from his pupil, Johann Jakob Honegger. I wrote a very long chapter in the book, and I have an equally long appendix about them. And I also have in my book the photo of the psychotic patient, Emil Schweitzer, the solar phallus man, whose psychosis inspired this controversy. The Honegger papers were indeed restricted when I started my work, but not, as Richard Knoll charged, because their content would prove that Jung was a liar and a thief, but because the Jung heirs rightly feared under Swiss law that legal action might be taken concerning the proper ownership and the copyright of these documents. They feared that they might have been taken into Swiss court and subjected to damaging financial punishment if these questions concerning copyright and legal ownership were not answered first. Shortly after Knoll made these accusations, the heirs decided that they had to take some sort of action to find a way to make these papers public. So they engaged a person known only as the expert, whom they will not have. All the crucial questions unanswered. Among them, who collected these papers? Who rewrote them into a fair copy of the originals? Whatever became of the originals? I am also happy to tell you that at the end of 2002, the Jung heirs and the new director of the Jungs Archives opened the Honegger papers to responsible scholars. Any of you who are judged accordingly can go there and read them. What I did not tell the heirs is that I had been reading and studying the Honegger papers since 1996. I'm telling you this today because, like so much else that I use in my book, to give but one other example, the protocols that became Jung's autobiography, The Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, there were, and there still are, copies of all sorts of papers out there in the world in the hands of people who took great care to ensure that the Jung heirs never knew they had them. Now, I think the situation of the provenance of the Honegger papers points out a crucial situation for scholars who investigate the history of psychoanalysis, and that is that the quest for historical truth is often dependent upon the circumstances. Many archives, both government and private, will not be open until dates far into the future. Others have been systematically plundered or destroyed by their partisans. Still others have been selectively culled by persons who believe that they have acted or are acting in the best interest of the history of psychoanalysis. Now, this is true, of course, in every field, but with the exception of politics, where files are routinely burned and shredded, nowhere is this more true than in the history of psychoanalysis. To go back now specifically to the Honegger papers, my copies, and I had several copies of these papers. They were made available to me under even stricter confidentiality than the analytic diaries I've already spoken about. The first thing that I had to do in the 7 years that I studied the Honegger papers was to commission a first-rate translation, a really superb translation from the original German into English. And here's another one of these amusing sidebar stories in the annals of scholarship. There are portions of these papers that are the originals in shorthand. And when I tried to have the shorthand translated, I learned that shorthand is different in every country. American and English people couldn't read this shorthand, and neither could German people. But when I took it to Swiss people, they said, oh yes, of course, this is our shorthand. So here's where integrating myself into the life of the community helped me enormously. I was explaining my problem at a dinner party in that very same ritzy suburb of Zurichberg to a group of business people who had only the vaguest idea of who that fellow Jung was. And among the guests, there was a Freudian analyst, and another guest was a very highly placed and very influential Swiss private banker. Both said to me, well, we have excellent Swiss shorthand. Why don't we translate the papers for you? So here I had these two incredibly prominent and very busy, distinguished people spending hours transcribing the psychotic delusions of the patient Emil Schweitzer. And that's why I was able to write about them when I wrote the epilogue and when I wrote the chapter about the papers. I'll move along now to tell you a bit about Freud's break with Jung, Jung's break with Freud. That too is an exceedingly long chapter with several hundred notes of documentation. And rather than getting into the intricacies of the relationship in a superficial way tonight, I'll tell you a little bit about how I arrived in part at the account I gave in the book. As I was writing that segment of my book, I was having interviews, conversations, and even arguments with the late Dr. Kurt Eisler, who was the dean, and some would say the dragon, who guarded the gates of the Freudian archives. One day in 1996, more than a year after our meetings had begun, my telephone rang and it was Dr. Eisler. And he said that he had been thinking a lot about what we had talked about. So he had just phoned the Library of Congress and asked them to send me a copy of an interview that he had in 1953 with Jung, and that he had originally restricted from public consideration until 2005. He said he thought that my explanation of the entire relationship between these two men, both as it developed and as it eventually ruptured, was probably the most objective account that we were likely to have for the foreseeable future. And so he wanted me to use his interview because he says it contributed to the description of the relationship between the two men. In his words, it puts flesh upon your biographical, factual skeleton. So I mention it here. It's far too complex to go into, but the Eisler interviews are scattered throughout the Freud chapters and throughout parts of the rest of the book. And I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Eisler because they certainly do enrich what I wrote. Now for the allegations of Jung's collaboration with the Nazis. The account that I present depends heavily on official documents, everything from German government archives to Jung's private correspondence with high-ranking Nazi officials of the Gleichgeschaltet, or the conformed Nazi psychology, which of course was the term for the subjugation of psychoanalysis under Nazi propaganda and political theory. Here again, I have multiple chapters about what Jung did or did not do. On the positive side, he recruited his own Jewish lawyer, Vladimir Rosenbaum, to write statutes that permitted disenfranchised Jewish analysts who were forbidden to practice in Germany to participate in professional life within the international analytic community. And he got those statutes approved right under the noses of the Nazis. Jung signed many attests, which were the legal declarations, that he would be financially responsible for the livelihood of individual Jews who managed to reach asylum in Switzerland if they could not support themselves. And as a matter of course, he gave them analysis free of charge. On the negative side, those who want to discredit Jung point to the fact that he did not resign his presidency of this international society until the end of 1941, which was well after World War II was underway, and to the fact that he continued to speak and write about how Jewish character and culture differed from the Aryan long after the war ended. Jung had two friends, both analysts, James Kirsch and Gerhard Adler. Both called Jung a man with his contradictions, and to me that is probably the most accurate description of Jung's behavior during the war years. He was politically naive, certainly, but he was determined to do good, even as he became embroiled in incredibly foul politics. Jung was alleged to be the man who flew routinely to Hitler's hideout to remind the dictator, oh, by the way, keep on persecuting the Jews, which is a totally unfounded and untrue rumor. What is true is that Jung was actually the man who advised General Eisenhower what sort of Allied propaganda to drop on the German civilian population in the last desperate months of the war. And Jung was the man whom Alan Dulles, director of Allied intelligence in Central Europe, recruited in 1943 to work for the OSS, precursor of the present-day CIA, under the heading, the title, the code name of Agent 488. Jung was an Allied spy, Agent 488. When Jung was starting to think about the work that became Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and here let me just pause and say that again, there is an incredibly long chapter and an even longer epilogue about this work and the difficulties of bringing it to publication. Jung insisted, as he was starting to write this work, that he was, and I quote, a somewhat complicated phenomenon. Well, each day as I wrote about him, I thought that this comment really didn't say the half of it. In my introduction in the book, I spoke of the heated arguments and the debates that came up every time Jung's name was mentioned in the most casual conversation while I was writing the book, and how I sometimes had to joke to diffuse these really electric situations. And so I began to say, oh, well, there's going to be something on practically every page to offend at least somebody, if not everybody. Well, in conclusion here tonight, I have to tell you that that's probably one of the truest statements I've ever written. And in conclusion, I just want to say that every day I spent in Jung's company as I wrote about him, his life and work, to me, they were truly absorbing. I did indeed find that writing about his life and work was fascinating and frustrating and contradictory and intriguing. But ultimately, if I have to make a final judgment, I consider him a person of importance and value and a major figure in the cultural life of the last century and certainly at the beginning of this century. And I hope that all of you, if you read my book, will share at least some of the experiences I had, and I thank you for listening.
I should, out of courtesy, thank you for your lecture, and so I do. But the other side of that coin is that you gave all the answers to the questions I not even asked. So let me go down to the gutter with my most elementary questions now. The first is, writing about Simone de Beauvoir and her feminism is to a certain extent feeling at ease, because the feminist side of her is easily to be identified with. You now, and time and again you have done so, stress, listen, in writing about Carl Gustav Jung, I am not a therapist. I am a literary scholar looking at this scholarly man, this man inventing a theory and practicing it. On the other hand, is not every biographer also well trained as a psychoanalyst of his or her subject?
Yeah, certainly. I think that the important thing for any biographer is to have a very deep and profound understanding of the person about whom the biographer writes. And I suppose, to use contemporary vocabulary, 20th century vocabulary, certainly this requires a degree of interpretation which borders on the analytic. All of us, I think, lay persons, are familiar with a great deal of the analytic vocabulary and the analytic practice and theory. And I think that everyone from historians to literary critics to biographers such as myself, I think we all certainly do incorporate the science of the mind.
But it creeps in easily when you, even if you would be writing about somebody who was not working in psychology and a theoretician as well as a practitioner, it pops in immediately. Doesn't it make you very self-conscious writing with that psychological lingo about a man who thought of it in the first place?
But you see, I don't use the lingo.
It pops up.
Well, perhaps. But I refer you to my biography of Anaïs Nin,
Yeah.
for example. I went to a group, it's well known that she had an adult incestuous relationship with her father, an affair, actually. And so I had a group of feminist psychoanalysts in New York City read those passages in the diary with me and help me analyze them to make sure that it had really happened. Did it happen as she wrote it? What do you as clinicians describe it as? And they would all say to me, but she's a borderline. You have to describe her as a borderline. And I'd say, no, you have to do it when you write the essays based on the information I give you in the biography. It is not my task to label her. It is my task to describe her for you. Biography is only the tool for other scholars to take and to use to explore specific areas within the biography in greater depth and with greater intensity.
But sometimes it's so tempting with Jung, because in all things he says about the mental health or state of other people, he seems often to lack insight in himself, don't you think? So.
Yes, I do, and I think that's a good essay for you to go and write.
But don't you find you have to help him sometimes?
No, I don't have to help him. I simply have to let him be the person that he was, and then I let you say this. I've had people who have said to me, but don't you see psychotic breakdowns at this point and that point of the development of his writing? And I say, well, maybe I did, but I'm not going to say it. That's up to you to say it. So.
Is it explicable why he kept such a distance to the analysis of his own state of mind?
I don't think that we can say that. I think that he self-analyzed himself at every step of the way. There are two documents, the Red Book and the Black Books. These are diaries that he kept of himself. The Jung family has just, in recent times, agreed to let the Red Book be published. Jung's translator, R.F.C. Hull, said, oh boy, if that's ever made public, the cat is surely out of the bag. He was the main patient in his own asylum. So this is now being prepared in a bilingual edition, English-German, and it should be out, I would say, within the next year and a half. And scholars will have the opportunity to see how Jung analyzed himself. They say they're not going to publish the Black Books, but I think perhaps they might change their mind about that too. So eventually you're going to get the documents and you're going to be able to see how Jung explained himself to himself.
You're very fair to him. In your lecture, you pointed out there are so many territories in which you easily can become part of a long-term quarrel, of a long-term feud, actually, about what Jung did or thought or lived or didn't do or didn't live or didn't think. And in those cases, you take a fair distance, collect as much material as you can, and leave it to us. You gave one beautiful example by saying in his relationship to women, it needs only the common sense of the reader to see, in some cases, how far he went and what really happened. You gave the example of Sabine Spielrein.
Yes.
You're very, I would say, principled about that distance in the book.
Well, you know, that's a very dear observation to me, and it's one that I do strive for, because I want the reader to trust what I tell the reader. I want the reader to be able to think that to the best of my ability, I may have made mistakes, I may have made misjudgments, but I want the reader to begin any one of my books with the feeling that I can be trusted. Certainly, you know, the reader is welcome to find mistakes or areas of disagreement or downright disapproval. That's fine, because that's intelligent intellectual discourse, and that's what scholarship is all about. But I do strive for fairness and objectivity always.
So what we don't know, we can't tell. As in the relationships with the women with whom he worked,
Yeah.
or were his patients.
Yeah.
That's the reason to keep that distance. But the same common sense you expect in your reader is, of course, the common sense you, as the biographer, share. So,
I'd like to believe that, yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
So sometimes you think more of it than you write.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, you should see the pages of passionate purple prose that don't ever get into the book. You should see my anger and my outrage and how my computer smokes when I'm putting all of this down on paper. And then I go back to it the next day or the next week and I say, all right, now, it's time for it to go. Doesn't belong there.
What an
And it
impressive
goes out.
demonstration of discipline. Because, as you say, and as you again said in your lecture as well, but you mention it quite regularly in the book, the relationship between the doctor, the therapist, and his patient, his female patient, wasn't yet clear,
Yes.
caught in rules and
Yes.
in regulatory statements,
Yes.
as it is nowadays. Nonetheless, common sense helps. You sometimes see Jung get into a relationship with a patient, and you don't need rules for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they call it transference, I think. Yeah.
So is that not a moment in which the biographer thinks, listen, discipline is a good thing, but why not be a bit judgmental?
If you want to... Why do I have to be judgmental?
You don't have to be.
No, you know why I don't have to be? Because you already see it. I write it in such a way that it's apparent to you, so I don't have to do it.
And is that all to avoid the traditional quarrels around Jung?
The traditional quarrels around Jung, I believe, are unavoidable. One, to write about Jung, one has to find herself right smack in the middle of them, and to be faced with all sorts of complexes and responses and reactions. I'll just give you one example. I am utterly amazed when the reviews came in from my other books. A lot of critics liked the book, a lot of critics didn't like the book, but they addressed the book. The reviews that I've been getting mostly in the United States and in England, like the one today in the Herald Tribune, for example, by Denisha Smith, she who wrote the article on the front page of the New York Times in which Richard Knoll called Jung a liar and a thief. She reviewed my book, and see what she said about the Honegger papers in that review. Not very much. At any rate, the responses, the reviews to my book, have not been reviews of my book. They have been the venting of all sorts of animosity and hostility and anger and outrage and position or feeling about Jung. At one point I said to a friend of mine, I have to take the title of Michael Moore's book, Dude, Where Is My Country, and I have to make it, dude, where is my book? You're reviewing Jung. You're not talking about my book. And it really was a shock of epic proportion to me when this happened. But a number of Jungian analysts, two in particular, Thomas Singer and Sam Kimball of the San Francisco Jungian group, are now writing about what they call the cultural complex. And they talk about how we hold to an idea or we hold to a concept so that no truth, no other position can penetrate the idea that we hold. And I'm finding this about Jung. A Freudian critic in the Washington Post said, Jung died in 1961, and so did his relevance. He is no longer worth consideration. Well, and then he goes on from there to bash Jung. Another man writes a review and says, Jung doesn't deserve a biography, especially one as bloated as this one. But he doesn't deserve a biography at all. He's one of those minor figures of the 20th century best forgotten. Where does this come from?
Yeah, well, where does it come from? Because already during his lifetime, we see that he invites strong reactions. That is this Freud disciple, Jones, who is very, very forceful in his response to Jung.
Yes.
But already from 1913, the break with Freud onwards, you see these strong reactions. So where do they come from?
And Jung has been dead for 50 years.
Yeah.
So why is this outrage still so strong? Why is this animosity still so strong? I don't know where it comes from. I've been speaking in a number of other cities and countries to professional groups, analysts who are both Jungian, Freudian, and many other persuasions. And I've asked them about this because I think that somebody should be writing about this. Somebody should try to explain it. I don't really have one specific answer. Perhaps a possibility is that when Freud broke with Jung in 1913, he rushed into print his own history of psychoanalysis in which he said, I created psychoanalysis, I own it, it is my creation. Well, what does this mean? You are God and you have given us 10 commandments from which we cannot deviate. Did Freud, by writing this text, put Jung into a box of his own making? A box that said, you, Jung, are the deviant, the disobedient son, and has that been the way that Jung has been regarded since 1913? Well, if so, Jung's death in 1961 was a long time ago. Why do we still have this feeling? That's only one possibility. I know probably within the audience there can be many more, and I think somebody should write about this.
The other side is his attraction, because as a therapist, he clearly was very much loved by his patients, sometimes going further than the love of the patient for the therapist. But he clearly had both, you mentioned them, the Pelzmantel from Zurich, his fans, his fan club in Zurich, as people very much attracted to his style of working. Mm-hmm. What made and still makes his type of psychoanalysis, of psychotherapy, so emotionally attractive?
Well, I think specifically to bring it up to the present day time, as I understand what happens in the Jungian consulting room, the doctor and the patient sit on two chairs and talk to each other, and the patient is usually asked to tell the doctor, why are you here? What is your particular concern? What is particularly troubling you? What would you like to resolve, to change, and so on and so forth. And the idea of the immediacy of this dialogue, of the doctor saying to the patient, you don't need to change your entire way of being in the world. What we need to do is to help you find a way to accommodate who you are into a successful, healthy and satisfying way of being in the world. And I think a lot of people find that dialogue, a dialogue about themselves, very useful and very helpful. This is what I've been told by a number of friends who have had a Jungian analysis, so that's the most I can offer.
His popularity was helped by the embrace in which the counterculture of the 60s took him. I mean, the whole interest in Hermann Hesse and, well, Switzerland again, is the atmosphere in which Jung flourishes, the interest for Jung flourishes. Again, we see that in the New Age movement. Does that put him, so to speak, in a certain corner of the room, in a certain box?
Yes, that's another one of the boxes. New Age in the very silliest interpretation of that term, and New Age in the very finest interpretation of that term. Jung fits under both those umbrellas, if you will. Jung, pardon me, was actually the person who, in a letter to a friend around 1945, said, "This is the dawning of the New Age. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius." He said that in a letter. As I said, around 1945, 46, something like that. And it made me think, was he the first person to have used these terms? I've asked any number of people to look them up, and nobody can find anyone saying this earlier. So I think we have to give him credit for coining the two terms. Yes, it does. It has both harmed and helped Jung to be considered under the rubric of the New Age. But I do think in the finest sense of the term, as we find ourselves at the dawn of this new millennium going forward and trying to make sense out of a culture and society which in many ways have disappointed us, we no longer find organized religion satisfying. Political entities, national identity are sometimes disappointing to us. And Jung offers a way through his process of individuation. Jung offers a way to help us become in touch with an internal kind of spirituality. I use that word advisedly. I use spirituality in the sense of a way of being in the world. And so I think that the many people in our contemporary societies who are in search of something meaningful and something to belong to frequently find great comfort in Jung's writings.
It is also in himself. If you read about his youth, there are these stories about an aunt and his mother interested in, say, the occult. And during his lifetime, he has had a deep interest for what we would call the supernatural, the non-evident and non-easily explicable thing. Is that a personal interest of him? Does it have to do something with Switzerland? Does it belong to a cultural style?
First of all, yes, it does have a great deal to do with Switzerland. Professor of literature at the University of Zurich, when I asked him about the fables and folklore of the Lake Constance area where Jung had the early years of his childhood, this professor said, "Let me point you to the 3-volume collection of Swiss folklore and cultural mythology, and you will find that many of the stories that Jung relates about the spirits, for example, who visited his mother, or the folk tales that he heard from the Lake Constance area, or the tales that came into the parish house about how drowned men behave, that sort of thing. You'll find them all in this impressive 3-volume collection of scholarship. And then again, people tell me that in the mountain villages of Switzerland, in the winter, in the snow, in the isolated little communes within the cantons, that this sort of thinking and talking and sharing of stories is relatively common. And then other people have told me that being the son of a pastor, that the village people come into the parsonage and speak to the pastor of these experiences, of these folk legends, and so on and so forth. So the boy would have been, the naturally curious little boy that he was, would have been exposed to all of this from a very early age. And then, of course, there was his mother's family, the Preisberg family from Basel, of the Bunting, the very highest social class in Basel. They all thought they were so much better than the Jungs. And his mother, his grandfather, was the president of the Company of Pastors, the senior religious personage in the Protestant church in Basel. And Jung's mother's job was to stand in the vacant chair that the pastor Prizework always kept behind him for the ghost of his first wife, who came to visit him when he was writing his sermons. And no one else was permitted to sit in this empty chair. And Emily Prizework, Jung's mother, had to have sort of a whisk broom to brush away the evil spirits who would try to interfere with her father's thinking as he was writing his sermons. So you can see just from that one example how deeply imbued this kind of thinking was throughout Jung's family and how it influenced his childhood and possibly contributed to his interest in mythology.
So he was a child of his time, and strongly so. I mean, the late 19th and the early 20th century. He was also a child of his country, Switzerland. Yes. How come he became so immensely popular in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the Anglo-American world?
That's very interesting, and it was the Americans who really discovered him, who put him on the map, if you will. They started coming to him as early as 1909, when he went to America with Freud. His ideas were certainly not as popular as Freud's were, but they were indeed well received by a certain class of person. Mostly the people who came to Jung were quite wealthy, self-made millionaires, the Rockefeller family, the McCormick family of the farm machinery business in Chicago, lots of wealthy Californians who had, I suppose, what we would call the pioneer spirit, the ones whose ancestors rode the covered wagons across the plains to the far country of California. And these people were questing and they were seeking, and they found something very attractive in Jung. So they were really the first ones who went to him. And I think if you examine the early English followers of Jung, the first members of the British medical profession, and other people in and around London, for example, who began to follow Jung, they had a little bit of the outsider mentality, or the independent mentality, the independent spirit. They weren't really governed by the dictates of culture and class. They were willing to think for themselves, and in many ways, these were the kinds of people who went to Jung.
Two of your earlier subjects, Samuel Beckett and Simone de Beauvoir, you've met as a biographer.
Yes.
In various relationships. So you could ask them things.
Yes.
And Simone de Beauvoir was much more cooperative, I think.
Well, not really. I was very discreet about what I said about Beckett, but I'm now writing a small book of 4 chapters, and it's called Bio/Memoir. And what it is all the personal stories, some of which I told you here tonight, that don't belong within the pages of an intellectual biography, but it's my personal memoir of the biographies that I wrote. And there I'm going to tell the truth about Samuel Beckett.
But you met them. Jung, you couldn't have met. He died in 61. So as a biographer, is it regrettable for the biographer not to have seen the subject?
Well, you know, you can see Jung in film, and you can hear him talk. And
that still is a distance.
Of course it is a distance, but you can get a feel for how the person behaves, carries himself or herself. I never met Anaïs Nin either. She was dead. She died in the 70s. But I could see her on film, and I could listen to her reading her diaries.
But you had a glass of whiskey with Simone de Beauvoir, which is a different relationship.
Very different relationship. With Simone de Beauvoir, my problem was to keep my distance. From the very beginning, I was chère Deirdre. And from the very beginning, it was, you know, come on, we have to help this feminist get a job. Come on, we have to go protest against whatever it was that Jacques Chirac or his people were doing at the time. It wasn't Chirac, I can't remember the...
It kept you from writing the biography. Yeah.
And she wanted, you know, come on, we have to have dinner and whatever. And I really didn't want that kind of closeness. I wanted to keep the professional distance. So I was very, very careful about the occasions. I picked and chose them very carefully.
But no chance with Jung? What would you have asked him if you had had a chance?
You know, I'm not sure that I would have been given all that much opportunity to do very much talking.
A short question. He would have done the talking.
He would have done the talking, yeah.
You spent 10 years with his papers, his thoughts, his philosophies, his life's history. You like him?
I ended the book with a great deal of respect for the man that I don't think I had when I went into it. I have a great deal of respect for his integrity, for the way he may have done things, he was, after all, a human being, that I didn't approve of, that I didn't like, that I would have done differently. But he really did live his life according to a certain personal integrity. And I give you what I think is the major example. When he broke with Freud, he said, well, I'm not following him anymore, so I can't use his psychoanalysis in my practice. I can't even use his vocabulary. If I'm going my own way, I have to find my own way. And he did. And again, to go to the 1930s, this position, he was the one who recognized what we all seem to be writing about these days, the difference in cultural identity, the multicultural society in which we live, the way in the United States all the signs now are in Spanish, the way we have Hispanic communities, we have African American communities, we have Native American communities. We are no longer the melting pot where English is the only language. We are recognizing the ethnic identity of so many groups, and there are people on each side of that question, whether it's wise to do this or not. Jung chose the most unfortunate example at the most unfortunate time, the case of the German Jew under the Nazi government, to serve as his example, but it was the example that he knew best. That was his community, that was his culture, and he wanted to write about cultural identity. It was terribly unfortunate that he chose that example, but he kept using it long after he should have dropped it. He should have been silent about it. He just, again, this personal integrity that one could call bullheaded, bully, the barrel, which was his childhood nickname, that he barreled over any kind of opposition to prove himself correct. But all of these are aspects of a personal code of ethics, a moral sensibility. And I did admire that about him.
The reader has common sense, the biographer has, the subject not always has common sense. May I ask you whether there are questions amongst you? There is a microphone standing there, so whoever...
Well, I would like to ask a question, please. I translated a part of your book, and when I was working on it, I was wondering why why there is so few attention to the development of ideas by Jung.
Well, I'll tell you,
it's not really a history of his ideas.
I gave as much as I thought belonged in a biography. And the reason was that I had so many facts and events, and I was, after all, writing a life. And I thought that I would write about the history of ideas and the development of ideas as they occurred within the chronology of the life, and that I would give, hopefully, enough information about each particular text or theory or idea that would intrigue the reader to say, I want to know more about this, I'm going to turn to Jung and read Jung's collected works myself. So it was a question of space. It was a question of organizing a great deal of material, as you can see. And so I thought the introduction of the idea within the time frame or the continuation of the development of this idea over a period of time, or how one idea then merged to become another, so on and so forth, that was a very deliberate choice on my part.
You don't even define some of the ideas you introduce in the text. For example, synchronicity is only defined very faintly. It's not very precise.
Well, I gave you, I think, if you look at the notes, I gave you the dictionary, the official Jungian dictionary definition of synchronicity. It's in the notes. I deliberately didn't put that kind of information in the text because I didn't want to slow down the story.
Okay.
but it's in the notes. There's a dictionary definition of synchronicity in the notes.
As I said, it is 150-page notes on 750 pages text, so a lot of information included. May I invite the next question?
Somebody's getting
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. Is that-
I just read the book of Laurens van der Post about Jung, and I thought it is a beautiful book, but I just wonder if you know it, and if you know it, what you think of it.
I do know it very well. I actually interviewed Laurens van der Post several times in his lifetime, and I listened to what he told me about Jung. And at the time I interviewed him, I thought to myself, this is my Jungian intuition, this is not a reliable witness. He has written a beautiful book, but he is not a reliable witness. I must pick and choose very carefully what I use of what he tells me. And I guess 1 or 2 years ago came a biography of Laurens van der Post proving that he was simply an outrageous liar, and that nothing he said was the truth.
Also in his travelogue, yeah.
Yeah. So also, you know, his African books, beautifully, lyrically written, but very little truth in them. So intuition told me that this was an unreliable witness, and I was very glad that I used him very, very sparingly.
Madam.
Yeah, I'm a Jungian analyst, and so for many years I've also been interested in the question of why so many bad feelings about Jung, or why so many through history and also in when modern people, Jung, it's either, oh, Jung, that's great, or, oh, are you kidding? That's horrible. Yes. So I listened very carefully when you talked about the idea of the cultural complex, and I know Thomas Singer also, I've talked to him about it, but I just want to take it one step further.
Please.
You said that with an idea of a cultural complex is that the whole culture can be in a state of mind with sort of a rigid point of view that doesn't want to change. And so an example would be sexism of the past, history, where women weren't accepted just by the cultural complex. Nobody had to think about it. It wasn't an individual issue. It was just women. So I'm wondering then if you were intending to say that because Jung was bringing something that was so new and so much against the kind of standard and rigid worldview, it brings up a sense of irritation and resistance.
Thank you for that. I think you're exactly right about that. I do. I agree with you on that. I think that's another dimension that needs to be incorporated into a full understanding of the situation. He brings things up that people perhaps might be too frightened or too unwilling to confront within themselves.
Right. Yeah, and in the Jungian world, this is one of the first things we learn, is there's a natural, healthy resistance to the unconscious. In every human being, we just want to feel like we have control.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you.
And he represents that. So.
Yes, I'm very glad you offered that comment. Thank you.
Are there more questions or comments, short comments?
Do you consider Jung himself a reliable witness in his own autobiography?
In almost
Jaffe's,
yes, in almost every instance I do, and I'm happy to say that although I haven't made an absolutely profound textual analysis of the various versions of this work, that the published work that you have is very, very close. If it's not actually what Jung himself wrote, it is very close to what he wrote in almost every instance. And he was terribly honest about himself. He agonized over the ways in which to describe himself, not as an 80-year-old man reconstructing his life as a youth. He wanted to try to put himself back into the way he was when he was 12 or 14. How did he feel? What did he think? And if he had to tell something that was personally embarrassing or distressing, he needed to tell it, because he would say frequently, "This is my truth, this is my reality." So I think he was an honest autobiographer.
Madam.
Thank you. I want to ask you something. Is there any truth or probability that there was a period that Jung was pushed or used or misused as an alibi for psychoanalysis by the Viennese psychoanalysts, who were known as a Jewish bunch of people? I speak as a descendant of one of them.
Freud exchanged with Abraham, and you see where Freud says frequently to Abraham, well, he's not one of us, he's a goyim, and he's not like us, but we need him. Freud would say to Abraham, you have to give in on this point because we need him. He's the Christian son of a Protestant minister, and he's of the Zurich school. Already there was a Zurich school as opposed to a Vienna school. So there are these remarks that are to be found in the correspondence of many of the people in the Viennese school, I'll just call it. So yes, Freud felt that Freud was politically astute, and it was very politically wise to have someone like Jung within his camp in those early years.
Okay, thank you. I think with this remark on the secularization of psychoanalysis, we might as well conclude. I thank Deirdre Bair for her lecture and answering my questions. Yes, if the mistake comes in, we all can go to the doctor. I pass the word to Gary Schwartz for the concluding remark. Can we stay here?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Monique, for asking me to close this evening. When you asked me to do so, you had no idea how well qualified I am to close this evening. You know that I'm the author of a biography of a person of also some importance in his own century, Rembrandt van Rijn. And one of the reviews of this biography said, why did Schwartz spend all of those years writing the biography of someone he so plainly disliked?
Oh.
I considered it beneath myself to write to the author of the review saying, why did you write a review of a book you so plainly dislike?
Very good.
But what she couldn't have known is that I am also a kind of heir to Jung. One of my earliest jobs in publishing in New York was with the Bunting Foundation, which is an exceedingly distinguished publishing operation funded by the Jung estate and dedicated in part to the publishing of Jung's papers, correspondence. But there I learned a degree of conscientiousness, a degree of honesty, attention to detail, and respect for quality, which I have seldom encountered in publishing or anywhere else. And I'm sure that in large measure, this must be a reflection of Jung's own way of working, because something like that just doesn't happen. So with these qualifications, I am uniquely suited to tell you what a wonderful evening this was. And how much I also responded and enjoyed the demonstration of conscientiousness, discipline, and dedication of Deirdre Bair, not only in the book, but also in her presentation this evening, and of Michael Simone's, the way he rose to this occasion so well. No, don't laugh. He really did. The reason Monique had for asking me is that this is the last time, I hope it's not the last time you see me at a rostrum at the John Adams Institute, but the last time I'll be wearing the badge of a board member. Finally, the John Adams Institute has decided to take seriously its responsibilities under the Code of Cultural Governance and to institute a rooster van aftreden. We're going to start rotating the members, and since I've been around longer than anybody can possibly remember, only Anna knows, I'm being rolled off the board, and I applaud this decision. I think it really is important. But at this moment, I wanted to pay my own respects and to utter my own testimonial to this wonderful institution with the wonderful people who run it, Anna and Monique and Marika also, who mans the office so excellently, and especially to the volunteers. It's simply impossible on the shoestring that the John Adams is run on to bring the lectures and the speakers, the music, the invitations, the bookkeeping, the entourage, collecting the tickets, without the work of a band of extremely dedicated, wonderful people who come here and do this for nothing, just for the joy of participating in something that they think is important. And our audiences, I mean, you're also volunteers, and it's wonderful that you do come, and I know that you'll continue supporting us. We felt very, very supported throughout these 9 years by all of the growth and the number of people who come to our lectures. We have really an astonishing record, and so we work well together. I want to thank you as well. And to invite you back for the very next lecture, which is another quintessential John Adams evening. This evening was quintessential because here was a biographer. Now, John Adams is about strong personalities. We bring you these people, and they stand up here, and they work the room. And that's what it's all about. And we had a wonderful demonstration this evening of strong personalities all around. Next time is another quintessential kind of John Adams evening. It's a very American evening. We've had a number of speakers from America involved in political discussion over the last years, and somehow or other, we haven't been able to come up with the right kind of left-wing critic. And I think the next lecture on March 8th, when Ivo Daalder is going to be here, I think maybe we finally hit the mark. And he is going to be introduced and questioned by Maarten van Rossum. So I really am looking forward to this evening, which unfortunately I'm going to miss because March 8th, I have the Code Art dinner. I thought it was going to be 9th or 10th. Okay, March 8th. I welcome you all back, and I wish you all and myself very happy future years of these wonderful events.